Hello everyone, hope you guys are doing good. Welcome to another episode of Reviews with Ranjani. I have a fabulous book for you guys today on creativity. And who better to write about it than the co-founder of Pixar, Ed Catmull. The book is called Creativity Inc. And Ed Catmull was the co-founder along with Steve Jobs of Pixar. So we're going to talk about 8 steps that he highlights, which organizations and your teams could use to build and sustain creativity. So without much further ado, let's quickly get started. The first one he talks about is dailies, or how people can solve problems together. So he says dailies are a key part of Pixar's culture, and in general people are not very comfortable with showing incomplete work. They do not want to appear dumb. But then the first step, therefore, that they teach folks at Pixar is how everyone is okay with showing incomplete work, and how everyone is free to make suggestions as well. And once they realize this, the embarrassment goes away, and that makes people more creative. So he says that leaders need to build a psychologically safe space for people to voice their opinions and get heard. And by coming together, the result is that as a group, you tend to see more clearly. All right. The second thing which he talks about is research trips. In filmmaking especially, or any creative venture, it's easy to look at past successes and kind of draw inspiration from them, which is okay. But he says that if you're heavily drawn by that, you fail to create anything authentic. So they talk about how we must go out and do research. And he gives this example of how when Pixar decided to do this movie of a rat who chooses to become a chef, they sent out this film crew to Paris to understand how 5-star Michelin star restaurants actually look. How does the chef hold his hand when he's chopping vegetables, for example? And these tiny details actually add this authenticity to the movie, right? So he says that you will never stumble on the unexpected if you stick to the familiar, and therefore you need to challenge your preconceived notions, and that's what will fuel inspiration, and that's what keeps us from doing new things rather than copying. Yeah. The third one is the power of limits, all right? And he calls this the beautifully shaded penny problem. So imagine this penny which is placed on a table in a movie, right? How much of effort has to go into shading that penny? How much is too much, right? So he says, how do you tell people to care less or be less excellent? But it's important to set useful limits, right? And also make them visible. Because you cannot do everything you want all the time, and you need to have the limits, and that will allow you to come up with smarter ways to work. So he gives this example of a system which was designed at Pixar, where they came up with popsicle sticks, right? And each stick represented a week of work from an animator, and these were pasted on a Velcro against every character. So if you kind of put in more on one, you would probably understand that you will have to have fewer on the other, right? So you had to make that trade-off. A beautiful way of representing the power of limits, I would say. The fourth one is how you can integrate, or you need to integrate technology with art. He talks about how both at Disney, which is the parent company, as well as Pixar, the integration of business, art, and technology is very important. He gives this example of how directors needed a way of providing feedback by drawing onto the animations themselves, the pictures, right, as the views to the animators. So then they came up with this digital stylus which allows the directors to draw directly on top of an image, right? And how this is an example of how the software developers work with the artists to make the end art better. Fifth one he talks about is short experiments. So he says that when you embark on an experiment, you never really know how it will work out, but you need to still do it, right? So he gives this example of short films, right, which cost them money but doesn't necessarily provide any, it's not monetizable. It doesn't give you any revenues. he says that this is required because that's the only way you learn, right, how things work out in both from a tech perspective, as well as it allows them to use this as a proving ground for fledgling directors. Okay, so he says mistakes are not avoidable, but you should be using them as learning opportunities. The sixth one he talks about is learning to see. He calls out what Pixar set up as Pixar University to give people classes around multiple things, like for example drawing, right? And he says the whole point was not to teach like software engineers to draw, but rather to think differently. For example, when you draw, if you have to draw really well, you have to switch off your left side of the brain, right? Because your brain needs to stop thinking of that as an image and think of it as an actual object, that's an actual shoe. So you need to focus on things outside of the object itself, right? So he says that the real point is that you can learn to train your brain to set aside preconceived notions and judgments and not have biases and ignore them, right? So learning to see. All right, so then the seventh point is what he calls postmortems, okay? These are meetings held shortly after the completion of every movie. And why do they do this? For several reasons, right? So he says, first of all, consolidate what has been learned, which can be taken forth, right? Also, because if there are resentments, you need to learn not to fester on them and provide a forum where you can address and let go of it, right? Also to pay it forward. And finally, he points out this very important thing, right? So he asks people about 5 things that they would do again and 5 things that they would do differently. Balance the negative with the positive as a means of getting good feedback during the postmortems. The last point, the 8th point, very important. He says, how do you need to continue to learn? He talks about, again, the Pixar University curriculum of having several of these classes outside of your day job, right? And why is it important is because when you sit next to people across teams, it proved to be very valuable, right? Because there was a lot of communication. People felt less vulnerable and opened up. So he says, first of all, we need to start thinking again from a beginner mindset. And he gives this example of how in his daughter's school, he realized that the first and second grade drawings looked very fresh versus the ones which are made by children in the higher grades. And that's because we become self-conscious and stilted in the efforts, right, that we put in. So he says we need to be not have this fear of judgment, and that hinders creativity. So always have this open growth mindset and continue to learn. Yeah, so those are the 6 steps. So I'm going to close this with this brilliant quote from that book. Failure isn't a necessary evil. In fact, it isn't evil at all. It's a necessary consequence of doing something new. Yeah, I'm going to list out these 8 steps again for quick reference in the website, so do check it out. I hope this has been useful. Also highlight if you would like me to review any other books. Yeah, thanks a lot. Talk to you guys soon.